contacted you. I mean, I contacted you for the podcast, but had you heard about the story, our story, or did you just find out because I sent you the link?
No, I found out when you actually from a couple of years ago. I remember hearing about intermix for the first time
No
for
way.
Redshift monitoring, and
Yeah.
uh, when you posted the reflection on Hacker News, I saw that and I was like, wow, this is not only extremely well written and thoughtful and something that we can learn from, but a really nice chronicle in time of
Yeah.
like the warehouse during that era and also data startups during that era, which I think are much different from data startups today, especially
Yes.
after the funding glut.
Yes. Very much so. Yeah. Yeah. Back then it was new, right? I was chatting yesterday with someone about data observability. That's actually a term we used. I want to say in 2018, and it was just too early, which is a nice way of saying we were wrong, right? But and people just weren't, yeah, in saying we were too early, people just weren't in a position to care about the quality of their data. They just weren't, right? And mainly because they were still in the early stages of using cloud warehouses. They didn't have that many transformation. Only few companies were using DBT running transformations. It was mainly Fishtown Analytics own clients, right? And so, yeah, and for me, the lesson learned is you need a big why now. Like, what's the why now for your company?
You know, I always tell people the difference between academia and startups is that in academia, you only have to be right. In startups, you have to be right and have great timing.
Yes.
And for what it's worth, sometimes I still wonder if it's too early for data observability, or however we call it, this more general concept that there's more than taking data from point A to point B, turning it into C, then putting it back into point A, where there needs to be some sort of a sidecar system to assure that things are performing to spec, right? It could be quality, spend, usage, anything like that. But I'm curious. So you started with Redshift, right? And you
Yep.
wrote about this transition from Redshift to Snowflake. What was it like in that moment, in a general sense, to see the rise of Snowflake?
Yeah. So I was mainly on the front line of the company, right? So my role was marketing and sales and also a little bit of customer support because we were a skinny team of highly qualified people. And look, funding, the funding was different back then, right? And so we didn't have this luxury of long runway. I think we had a little bit less than 2 million in the bank. We needed a good team. So, we were under pressure, and we had a skinny team and we were getting traction. We had all these great companies. I think I wrote it, Plaid, Postmates, I'm drawing blanks now, but it was the who is who. And we work fantastic data engineers, right? Also, just the best possible people anyone could ask for. And what I saw Snowflake creeping in. And then one of my good friends was also a sales rep at Snowflake, and I heard how he was killing it, right? And so I had these anecdotal signals from our users, right? I heard that. It was like, hey, we're looking at Snowflake. Do you guys support Snowflake? It's so much better. It's so much easier. So we heard that. I heard from my friend that he was killing it. And then I remember how, I think there was a newsletter, how Tristan preferred Snowflake over Redshift, right? And so I had all these, it's like looking at a house. I heard this, like one of my former bosses at Accenture used this analogy. Like you look at a house and there's smoke coming out of the house, right? And it's like you lift one curtain and there's smoke. You don't see fire. You lift another curtain, there's smoke, but you don't see fire. And you do that with like 3-4 curtains. there's only smoke coming out of it, but you don't see any fire. But there's likely fire in the house because there's so much smoke coming out of all the windows. And that's what it felt like at the time with Snowflake. And then some people gave us a heads up, like WeWork. My friend Tarush, who now himself has a company called 5X, he was the head of data at WeWork, and he told me, it's like, yeah, hey man, we're migrating off Redshift. We're going to Snowflake. We tested it. It's faster. It's more expensive, but we don't care, right? It's we love it because our dashboards are fast. And so we noticed that, and the fallacy back then for us that we argued with market share. And I think I wrote that in the blog post. Redshift's footprint at the time was still, 10 times, 20 times higher, right? There's this, I can actually show this in a bit here, DB engines. There was that, so the fallacy was to argue with market share. Redshift was much, much bigger, but it was a paradigm shift, right? And so Snowflake was easier. And it was one of these lessons learned is when a new technology conquers the market, it just pulls its customers in. And even though it has a much smaller footprint in terms of market share, that's the market segment you want to align yourself with because it's growing faster. So that was a long answer to your question, but I gave you a few data points.
No, that's so interesting to hear because, not only do we now see what it's like a few years after the fact, right? But at the same time, it's imperfect information, right? And in many ways, like, we had to read the tea leaves again because the market is shifting around us. Of course, it's constantly shifting, but especially in the past couple of months, right? I think Joe Reese just published a really nice blog post about this. Like, how do data teams themselves change as the economic condition changes, right? People are forced to do more with less. People aren't able to spend as much on things without like really clear proof in the pudding. So it's like, well, on one hand, so many startups have the runway to kind of like shield themselves against Darwin's scythe, right? On the other hand, it's like, are we just delaying the inevitable for a lot of us? It's hard to say, and I think we see some smoke. I think sometimes the smoke is because the house is burning. Other times it's because they're cooking a really nice roast. Who knows?
Who knows?
I don't know. Like you said, it's impossible to know, but you kind of have to make a bet. Like, not doing anything is a bet, as you know.
You're absolutely right. So let's look at this. This is the DB engines trend chart that I was looking at the time, right? And so I'm leaving Postgres in here because it's a nice benchmark of knowing what's popular. And so the chart we looked, and this goes back, yeah. So let's see what we have here. I'll pick Snowflake. I'm leaving Hive in there, Apache Hive. And then there's Databricks, BigQuery. Well, I don't need FileMaker, right? And so let's see here. So you can see here, we started the company, I think 2017, 18, right? And so Snowflake was far below Redshift, right? 10x, right? So this is logarithmic. And so that was the fallacy looking at it. And you can just see here how Snowflake started to kick in. BigQuery was around, and you can see they overtook Redshift now. But here, this is what happened, right? This is September 2020, and that's when we were about to go out for another round. And then COVID happened, right? The world crumbled, literally. Like, capital markets dried up. I think the Nasdaq dropped by 30%. It was like the single largest drop since, was it Black Friday or Lehman? I don't know, but it was a lot, right? And so you can see here how the world shifted to data, and Snowflake was there, right? It was the easy option, and they had great marketing. Chris Dagan, the CRO, was also the first sales rep, and and so we got caught in that, and we actually had something that would have worked for Snowflake, right? And so we really turned around on a dime, and we were purpose built for Redshift, right? And what we did is we took the parts that our users cared about, and tracing, data lineage, all of that. And we took those parts and turned them into a new product. And that would have worked. That product worked for Redshift, obviously, but it would have worked for Snowflake and all the other databases too, right? And in fact, we had users like WeWork who said, "Hey, we're going to do this with you guys." But then COVID came. But you can see here how, yeah, Snowflake just took off, and conquered the world.
Yeah, that chart is, I mean, 2 ticks in a logarithmic graph.
It's crazy,
Y-
right?
Yeah, that really is crazy. I'm curious, like, what would you do differently if you were to take the same value prop, but in today's market? And this is clearly a selfish question.
Yeah. Uh, I would. I mean, I'm in a way we're facing the same. Any startup faces that problem, right? And so what I would do is, and this is what we're doing, I would talk to as many users as possible and get a detailed description of what their issues are. And I do that when I talk to people. I use a transcription service when I can, and ask them why. Like, why do you care? Why is this important? And when they say, oh yeah, that would be super helpful, is that would be helpful, or is that a hair on fire problem? And actually, one of my friends, John Turo, he's a VC at Madrona, and he used to be a senior PM at Amazon, and he's really good breathing down my neck, asking me what's the hair on fire problem. So in general, I think you really need to identify the hair on fire problem. I think for data observability, my guess is that it's a hard concept to understand for people because the industry is so new, right? They care about dashboards. These people care about Tableau. They're pretty dashboards wherever it runs, meta-based, right? They want to have their sales data. That's what they want to have. Explaining to them, like they must have experienced, I feel like they must have experienced the problem, right? Where the data all of a sudden changed. There's a big spike, or there's something that changed, and or that's something that got really slower in their dashboards or data department. They must have experienced the pain, and I think they need to realize that this is mission critical, because if your data is wrong and you're making fundamental decisions based on that data, then you have a problem. So, and I would also try to find I would name the problem, like give the problem a name. What is the data observability is the solution. That's the category, right?
Right.
But what's the problem that you're trying to solve? Like, I would give that thing a name. And that's something we're doing right now as well. The same thing with infrastructure data. Like we're trying to call it data fragmentation. We'll have to see if it sticks. But I think that the biggest thing you can do is give this thing a name, a problem, and then own that. That's your hill that you want to claim, right?
Totally. Yeah, and in some ways, I'm ambivalent. I'm not sure what to think about the term data observability. I mean, I think the analogies to Datadog and Splunk, etc., are clear, but like you're saying, it is a solution. It is a technology, and the problem, at least as we see it, is being the first to know of data issues, as opposed to a VP of sales looking at a Looker dashboard and telling the board the wrong number. Comes knocking on your door in Slack. So this disconnect between problem and solution, because you could solve that problem without a tool, right? And
Yeah,
many teams do solve it without a tool. There's more people, more processes.
yeah, yeah,
I'm very curious to see where the market goes because, like, finger in the wind, when you take Metaplane, when you take everyone in the data observability category, you add us up all together, the revenue is not that much,
yeah,
right? It might be a few percent of the total addressable market today, to say nothing of the total addressable market in 10 years. And in some ways, I view that as like a proxy for how many companies check the box of data is business critical, right? It's not a dashboard that people don't really look at that often, and it's not super important or not important enough to warrant like very fast detection of issues or resolution of issues, that they're problem aware and they're solution aware and they have the budget
Yeah.
and the buy-in. So checking all those boxes, tiny pond.
Yes. You're talking to a smaller and smaller segment. Yeah. What are some, I was listening to a podcast yesterday, the Rudder Stack one from the Data Stack show
Right.
with Eric and Costas,
Love
and
them.
yeah, they're great, right? But they had somebody on the call, and I think he had a vertically integrated product for, I think it's Spectre, for financial data, right? And so I think he integrated the data source with the data pipeline and the data quality, right? And there's also like a compliance aspect because you're dealing with the financial services industry. And so I think there's a signal there, like, hey, there's a market that or segment that really cares about data observability, and that's financial services, right? So maybe I'm hypothesizing, but maybe that's one angle. Who else would care, right? Definitely financial services, insurance, anything that touches consumer finance. I would guess.
Right. I like FinServe, 100%. That's what we see too. We got a lot of pull from that market. Ecom and consumer is very big as well. I was just walking down Newbury Street, like the shopping street in Boston, and I looked around and I realized wait, so many of these stores are our customers. Like we can sell to every single one of these stores, and I mean, I would argue in the case of FinServe, right, data equals negative money, right? Because you have to meet these uh, external compliance requirements. But for ecom, and of course, data equals positive money too. But for ecom, it's very similar. And in other verticals, I'm very curious what you're seeing. It's you get a spattering, right? B2B SaaS is kind of like a roll of the dice. Sometimes you'll pick this Series C company and they're using reverse ETL. They have an onboarded, uh, super high functioning data team. Data's going everywhere. Other times you pick it and it's like, okay, our our data is in Postgres and we have like home built dashboards uh, just to send out our investor updates. It's so hard to tell from the outside.
It's Postgres is alive and kicking. It's so many teams still use it as their data warehouse. You saw it in the chart, right? It's
Yeah,
still
yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm not going to knock it. We use Postgres. I love it. And, I think it could be an appropriate warehouse with the right tuning for the right data sizes and teams. But
yeah.
that's a whole nother subject too, which is we think in our space, Snowflake is the big fish. And of course, a $60 billion company is a very large fish. But look at Oracle's market cap, look at IBM, look at SAP's market cap, right? How many, we there's the myth of the haggard, graybeard veteran programmer who is running COBOL, holding up the
Yeah.
world, right? I
Yeah.
guarantee you that he is using an IBM Z series mainframe to
Yes.
store that data.
Yeah. Yeah. It's yes, it's still there. And I kind of know that because at my last company, we got acquired by IBM, and the mainframe business just keeps growing. Because you can't rip it out. All the banks and insurances, they run on mainframes, and yes, they pull that data into some mainframe. Yeah,
And not only did you have to migrate the data, but now you had to figure out what to do with this box too. So it's like a double a literal physical migration too.
yeah. I'm looking at your website, the Metaplane platform. I think you lay out the use cases really nicely, or the capabilities, testing and anomaly detection, schema change alerts. Yeah, usage analytics was a big one. Can I
Please.
share this tab instead? Here, there you go. Um, hold on, share. Da, 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 'da. 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 ' Yeah. So this one was a big one, right? Look, based on my historic knowledge, I think the stuff that people cared about. Look, people cared about it when it stopped working. When things worked, don't touch it. That was one hurdle we had to overcome. Where we said, look, if you just wait for things to break, you're in a world of pain, right? Because what happens next is that you get all these Slack messages. People complain that their dashboards are down. The CEO complains that the 6 a.m. report doesn't come in. So all these things, right? And we said, like, look, if you do this now, then you don't have to deal with these fire drills. And I think the fire drills probably are much more frequent and bigger today than they were 3 years ago, right? Because today we're dealing with way more data and way more transformations. So the things that people like the things we had signal for was definitely job monitoring. That's something we did, right? Like, why does this job went from let's say 5 seconds to 50 seconds. Oh, why did it go to 50 seconds? Let's see. You know, they okay the job is joining these two tables, right? Okay, great. Well, one of these tables went from, I'm making this up, right, from 1,000 rows to 100,000 rows. Well, why did it go to 100,000 rows from 1,000 rows? Well, let's see. Oh, there's an insert that added these 99,000 rows. Well, why did that happen? Well, where's the data pipeline? Oh, that was a job from segment. Okay, well, what happened there? The segment job pulled a new data. What was it? Oh, they changed something in the instrumentation for their mobile app. Oh, what is it that they changed? Oh, they ingested more events. Like a developer made a change in ingesting more events, right? And maybe it was like a specific, I don't know, whatever it is, advertising event or something like that, right? And it's like, oh, who was that developer, right? And so that was the chain. You would have to go back to understand why this job went from 5 seconds to 50 seconds. I'm just using round numbers, right? So that was one example that people cared about. They
That
started caring.
is,
Yeah.
that is such a good example and something that we see all of the time. And I think it really highlights an underlying issue, which is degradation, right? Where like in our world, whether it's infrastructure or code or data, it's like, okay, there are some like binary pass fail flags, right? If you violate referential integrity in your transactional DB, that is a problem.
That's a
But
problem.
so many things are just like silent, like creeping on you. That job that goes from 5 seconds to 50 seconds, that query that now takes $200 per run versus $2 per run, these
Yeah.
things don't necessarily happen overnight.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And I'm looking at all of this. Like, my recommendation to anyone is to it's the thing with monitoring, right? Like, people only start implementing it when it's production critical and someone yells at you and your job is at risk, right? And so, but all these things matter, right? Usage analytics was a big one because the number of tables in your warehouse just start to explode, right? Well, how do you know if they're still active, right? And the argument is always like, well, storage is cheap, so who cares, right? But it just adds to sprawl. And using the burning house analogy, right? It's just like adding more furniture to your house. And then either you buy a bigger house, even though you don't need it, right? But you also have more stuff that can burn, right? And so look, this is like the stuff that a good VP of data should implement this, because otherwise I think you're going to run in all the well-known issues by now, right? Overspending, model sprawl, incorrect data, right? It's like all of this good stuff. I'm preaching to the choir. You know this
I mean,
best, right?
well, I mean, you know this best. I mean,
Yeah.
we're like at the core, all like you were the first, to my knowledge, right? And like the out of all the observability tools, like this is not a new concept. Even in decades past, people were having some orchestrator write SQL checks against their uh, DB2 instances, uh,
Yep.
having jobs run on the side in Informatica Power Center to validate this as well. But the I mean, there's nothing new in our space, but there's also many other aspects of it which are new. And I'm happy you pointed out how do we, the urgency to buy, right? Because for us, we segment the market into three, like once we drill deep into our ideal customer persona, I would love your advice on this is, okay, you have a data leader at a high growth company, like mid market is our sweet spot. They could be in an industry like FinServe. The business can be data critical, but then even there's almost like three buckets of people's attitudes towards data observability. There's the I have worked in an engineering role or adjacent to an engineering org, and I know how useful, for example, Datadog is. So the analogy is clear. That's why we pitch ourselves as Datadog for data. And then there's the people who kind of want to get ahead of the curve, right? The early adopters who hear about this sexy new category. And then there's another third who wait for shit to hit the fan before doing so. And I don't blame them, right? Like there's so many conflicting responsibilities and an overflowing plate of things to do as a data leader. Like, of course, unless something is burning, unless the house is on fire, I'm not going to keep a fire extinguisher in it. Uh, well, okay, maybe that analogy makes it clear that you should keep a fire extinguisher in it no matter what.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but at least in a new space, for someone who's never heard of a fire, yeah, like I
Yeah.
don't blame people.
So what I've seen is, and I like these three buckets, right? That reflects what I see or have seen. I think so. You said so maybe Series B growth stage, right? And so a lot of times growth is obviously growth is the priority, right? And then as long as growth is there, no one cares about the bottom line. There was plenty of venture money available, and nobody looked at that, right? And so I think that's one hurdle to overcome. What I saw, look, we had all these conversations with data teams, right? And at the thing is, and that was one of my insights, data wasn't mission critical in some of these cases. It was just a dashboard, right? It's not like your e-commerce cart is down. And so that was a challenge. And so then now you sort of need to deal with the individual data engineer or head of analytics engineering. And a lot of times it depends a little bit on the personal belief system and the personal pride. I remember, I'm just calling them out, Gusto. They had their shit down. Oh my God. I mean, we came in there and I was sitting there with my co-founder and we just looked at each other. It's like, hey, congrats. Can we talk about you guys? Because it's just, you have it down, right? It works. And look, it's stuff that no one sees, and you don't get promoted for it if you have a clean warehouse, clean transformations, everything is documented, right? You don't get promoted for that. That's
Right.
the sad thing, right? But they did it because they believed in it, right? And then on the other hand, we met engineers, and now I'm not going to say names, where it was a giant mess, right? And it was this thing where it's just the way it needs to be, right? And they kept their warehouse this dark box, and because few VP of engineering, I still see this division between the production side and the analytical side of the house. And a lot of times people just didn't have the knowledge to go to that data engineer and say, what are you doing? Like, show me, right? And they would get a response, no, that's the way it just needs to be, right? I saw that a lot of times. And in fact, some of our best or fastest converting customers were companies where that data engineer moved on to some other company, left behind a giant mess. And so, the first thing people did is Redshift monitoring. They found us. And then they would come to us because we also offered the professional services that help them untangle the mess, right? So knowing is one thing, doing is the other thing, right? And in hindsight, we should have just started a professional service business and use the tool just to shine and increase our gross margin. Sorry, that was again like a long-winded answer to your three personalities, but that's what we observed back then.
It's, I mean, it's very surprising to me. I mean, I was kind of bracing myself. I think all us founders were over the past couple of months about, what is growth going to be like in this new economy, right?
Yeah,
And two things were really surprising. One is that our sales numbers, like we're hitting our goals better than ever, earlier and higher goals. And two is that unfortunately, a lot of the teams that thought about using Metaplane or do use Metaplane had a lot of transition and restructuring. Sometimes the data team is a fraction of the size,
yeah,
and they and my I expected to see, okay, well, Metaplane is used by data teams, and if there's no data team, they're not going to use Metaplane. But it's like you're saying, I was very pleasantly surprised that they keep Metaplane. They're like, okay, this thing is happening, and we don't want to touch it, right? Is like, and if anything, it's more important than ever that we find out about issues because the tribal knowledge, the ongoing awareness is no longer there. Uh, and to your
yeah,
second point about services, isn't it so surprising that you go into a conference and you have all these vendors, including us, who, when you add it together, don't make very much money. Maybe they will in the long run. But then you have these consultancies, right? The Montreal Analytics, the Brooklyn Data Co's in the world,
yep,
who like they're very successful businesses, right?
yeah. That's a signal we had too. And in fact, I mean, I used to joke, right? I've probably optimized more Redshift clusters than anyone else on this planet. And but we were a product company, right? What we should have probably done is say, okay, there clearly is a signal for consultancy here, and we're just going to run with that, and we're going to keep building product revenue underneath that. That would have been an answer, right? Probably also the answer. And look at what, I mean, that's what Fishtown Analytics did, right? They started as a consultancy and started building DBT underneath, and then it took off. And I think it is because there's people like to interact with other people, right? And getting this knowledge from these consultants is incredibly valuable, right? If they combine it with actual deliverables, like, hey, let me change this, then it's incredibly powerful. And I mean, my career started with consulting, right? I worked for Accenture, and so it's arguably the most successful professional services in the world, and people just like that. They like the advice from experts. They like being able to work with a consultancy that can pull in experts on any specific topic. And yeah, so that was the signal for us, and I believe it that these companies, I believe it. They're still successful. It's
Right.
still early. It's still day one in data.
It, it's for me, it seems like the combination of you know the space, the best practices, the tools are changing so much. So not only is this person uh, kind of imparting some of this knowledge, but also because it is changing so much, there's a little bit of insecurity.
Yeah,
Right. I mean, I don't blame people at all, right? And it's nice to talk to a person. You mentioned 5X. Tarish is great. We have
yeah,
some shared customers. Lucky to be a very small investor there as well. And
good. Yeah,
it, it, I think it's a brilliant model, right?
yes. People, I think people are starting to realize all this complexity um, that has been built in the past 2 years needs to stop. And I think the economic pressure is making it real now. And at the end of the day, people want simplicity, right? But they also want stuff to work. So I actually think for data observability, it's like now is a great time, right? Because everyone's under pressure. And, the other thing I'm thinking is that is there a persona? Is there something like a data quality engineer? Probably not quite yet, right? But maybe in bigger companies, right? But that's almost like the role you want, where a person has that task and maybe a metric, right? Like, hey, the average, or like, the P99 percentile in terms of freshness for our data is X, right? I don't know what the KPIs would be, but I would probably look to establish those, right? Like, hey, a good whatever the outcome is of the data observability, right? But like the key data observability metrics is like your P99 for data freshness should be X, right? The P99 for uh, uh, the
Like like uptime of dashboards, something
uptime
like
of
that.
dashboards, yeah, yeah. The average execution time, not the average, the P99 for your execution time should be lower than 1.5 seconds. I don't know, like
Right.
but something like that, right? And you show that, and I think it just creates more confidence in data, and people will be confident to make decisions by using data. And I think that's sometimes like the missing piece for some of these companies.
I know that there was and might still be a rise of data quality engineers, data reliability engineers, like a counterpart to an SRE. I
Yeah,
think you're right. That might only be at large companies. Like, how many growth stage companies, really amazing companies, have 3-person data teams? It's like we have
yeah,
3 data engineers, 3 analytics engineers. How are we going to have 1/4 of our team be
yeah.
dedicated to quality? So I think I'm curious, how how big do you think the data market will be relative to the software market? I know it's very hard to measure and it
Oh,
depends.
that is a great question. Yeah. I mean, if you argue that, it's hard to say. I mean, we saw the Snowflake chart, right? I think so. The the data you process, right, is generated by the production systems. And if you think about like the revenue the production systems generate, then it can't be any bigger than that, right? Because like the money comes in, right? Like you're shifting everything to cloud computing, the underlying production infrastructure. That's the addressable market for AWS, GCP, and Azure, right? And so that infrastructure and those systems that run on it, those systems generate data, right? And so um, thinking about it like that, I don't think it can be bigger. I'd be very surprised, right? Because you're still dealing with the top line revenue. But I think where are we in terms of market size? I don't even know compared to cloud computing, but is it maybe 10% right now? I think where you so I think it can never be within that paradigm. It can never be as big as the general cloud computing market. And I always think about it as production analytics. But I think what can happen is if you're shifting to this new world of data apps, where you have apps that actually become part of a production process or generate revenue, then the whole conversion, the whole equation switches, right? And I think like what would have to happen so that it becomes at least as big, if not bigger? Well, that means you would have to generate revenue with it, right? Because then that revenue can fuel the growth underneath. So I would be looking towards data apps, right? And I think we're seeing some of that, right? What Snowflake is doing with Streamlit. So that's my best thinking, my best foot forward to this question.
That makes because it also injects like another perspective on it. And for what it's worth, I do think the current number is like around 10%. If you add together market caps naively, it
Yeah.
ultimately comes down to, right, Snowflake and Databricks versus AWS, if you the first order approximation,
Yeah.
uh, because like you're saying, and we can maybe reason in terms of headcount too. Like, what would it take for a data team to be roughly the same size as an engineering team? And I think what you're saying is resonates a lot, right? It, unless you have a data app where data is tied to revenue, it is hard to justify the same order of magnitude of
Yeah.
teams.
Yeah. Yeah, precisely that. I mean, these data teams are still tiny, right? But it's also, I think, a great example of how much leverage there is in data. Like running a data infrastructure with a tiny team like that, it's pretty impressive, right?
One of a good friend and a great data leader now at High Touch, but he was the first data lead at Vendor. His name is Eric. He was hired when Vendor was around 30 people as their first data hire. And he came in because he was at WeWork as well and also at DOS 42. And he had this concept of the leverage of a data team. And he measured it in terms of the ratio of like tool spend versus headcount spend. I think it's pretty creative. And he said, okay, how can we basically maximize that as a proxy for like the team doing more with less, like doing more per headcount? And he was able to keep that team at around 5 people, I believe, even as Vendor grew to hundreds of people.
Yeah.
Uh, he's definitely living in the future. I don't know if this will be. I think it'll happen more. I don't know if it'll happen across the board, but I really love that way of thinking.
Yeah. I'm looking at your website and the customer case studies. They're really powerful. Um, yeah, there's vendor. What a business, right? What Ryan created there.
Truly, I mean, such massive inefficiencies in that market, and no, I think there's so much ahead of them. Like the market is, I mean,
Yeah.
enormous.
So maybe can you talk a little bit about these customers or your Metaplane customers who figured it out? I think this is one great example. Like what is specific about those customers that makes them great users of Metaplane, and what's sort of the transformational impact that Metaplane have for them? Because I think that's like, if you can identify that, then and find more of those people, then you're going to be a rocket ship.
Our customers are they vary in size quite a bit. Uh, Sometimes we have smaller companies with one-person data teams. Other times we have like these hundreds of years old, like 10,000 person companies.
Wow.
And that what's surprising is the need for observability, I would say, is like roughly flat, which was surprising because for other tools, this is not the case, right? A data catalog, you probably don't need a data catalog if you're a one person data team. The need kind of goes up over time. Uh, at least that's what we found when we were building a data catalog. But for data observability, like, yes, if you're this 50-person data org and you're a public company and you need to meet these requirements, but at the same time, if you're the one person data team, you can't go on vacation. You can't take this holiday without shit hitting the fan.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
the companies that we found to actually answer your question have the most success with Metaplane are those that have data be business critical. And I know we mentioned that a couple times, but also have had the opportunity to be on a modern stack that they own and have the the vision and like the motivation to keep trust high, to keep the data culture at a very high level. I'm thinking of, for example, Marion at Mux, right? Data is extremely important to their company. She was on the team very early and wants to keep trust up here. Vendor is a great example. Imperfect Foods, spot on. And I think when those criteria are met, there's so much opportunity to bring on data observability, and most importantly, like we're just a tool, right? But to really build processes around observability as well. And that's where the magic really happens
Yeah.
is when you have like people who care about the alerts that we send, people who are looking at our lineage and our usage. Uh, and now it's like, okay, I'm plugged in, right? It's like Minority Report. Like now I have my mission control.
I mean, look at that. A single data engineer or analytics engineer.
They do amazing things. Uh, it's I really love our customers because, yeah, I mean, they punch so far above their weight.
This is interesting here. Um, I think this is key. And if eventually somebody's listening to this and not watching it, right? So it says leveraging. So this was before, right? Leveraging Airflow, Datadog, and some simple dashboarding. She had built a custom data observability tool that notified her when something broke. That gave her some visibility into the quality of her company's data. But although it took her weeks to conceptualize and build, it only provided her with about 60% coverage. So I think I would love for you to unpack that a little bit because I see a few things here. That number one, she realized she had a need and she went to existing tools. And most of the times, and I see this today as well, dealing with infrastructure data, people go to Splunk and Datadog, right? I'm just trying to get data. And it's like, oh, this is monitoring. I'm going to use a monitoring tool, which is the wrong tool or not a great tool because we're talking, we want to do exploratory analysis, right? Versus real-time monitoring. But anyhow, so I'd love to understand how it went down, what how Marion was willing to give up her little baby, right? Because she built it. Let's be honest, right? Like people are attached to it, and then realized she needed something more industrial or productized. I'd love to hear that story because it's very very powerful what I can read here.
Yeah, the Marion and I were actually lucky enough to give a talk on this at DBT Coalesce. Maybe we could link it. The talk was called "More Metadata, Less Problems." But when Marion, who is amazing, uh, was at her previous company, it was a large public company, and this was a couple of years ago. That right, she used existing tools to build data observability herself, and none of the offerings on the market were really available then. I believe that she she was facing the problem herself, and she was facing this problem of like, how do I meet all of these demands and work on strategic projects when so much time of me and my team are being taken up by issues that, like, not only could they have been, some of them could have been prevented, but other ones could have been resolved faster if we detected it faster. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but that's the picture that uh, I have. So that when she came to Mux, it was very clear. Like, okay, I kind of want what I built, but in a tool. And she did a vendor evaluation and ended up, thankfully, choosing Metaplane for many reasons. Uh, and I think that this is how the market is going to grow, where you have this rise of business critical data and data teams. But at the same time, you have people with who encounter these problems and then they move companies and then they start new data teams or move on to other data teams.
Yeah.
Uh, it's unfortunately, I think, a little bit like insurance, right? It's like, yeah, I- I'm careful with my phone. I don't buy Apple Care, but
Yeah.
I only need to drop it once to start buying it. and then I'm going to survive it for life.
Yeah. Yeah. Insurance is a cost until you need it.
Exactly. No, 100%. And Marion's story is like inspiring, but it's not unique. Like a lot of our customers have built in various forms, like data testing and data observability frameworks, even if they wouldn't call that, and not all of them were fully fledged tools. They they've done it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating. I see in your website that you're HIPAA compliant. How soon did you do that?
We did it about a year in. We got, yeah, I mean, even though Metaplane and all of the observability tools don't store data, right? It's aggregate statistics, uh, summary metadata. It's not PII or PHI that ultimately we do have like read access to this data. So like SOC 2 was extremely important. SOC 2 and HIPAA and GDPR compliance. Uh, it's, cynically, you could say that it's to unlock more deals. But for us, we're sweating bullets, right? It's like our customer data is so valuable. It's precisely because the data is valuable that they bring us on. So we have to treat it like it is valuable too.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah, it's we had these conversations earlier. Like for instance, we couldn't get Zenefits back then as a customer because we weren't HIPAA compliant, right? And that was another lesson learned, actually. Like you should be oh, and we had a large insurance company in the Midwest. I forgot which one it was, but massive, right? And we couldn't do it because we weren't HIPAA compliant. And that's another lesson learned, right? Like make sure that if you identify your segment, that you have the certifications to sell into that segment, right?
Shout out to Vanta.
Yeah,
Uh, Shout out to Christina and Verona. Vanta's amazing. They've made our life so much easier in that regard.
yeah, yeah. But there was no Vanta when we started, right? It didn't. That's why we didn't do it, right? Like getting HIPAA. I remember the only company at the time was Mode Analytics, right? They were HIPAA compliant, and I remember how it was a big deal for them, right? Because just doing that was so painful.
Yeah, I can't. I was pleasantly surprised when there's like a substantial amount of overlap between these certifications, right? Like if you have your house in order, you might have to get another room checked out, but I
Yeah,
mean, the, talk about making things easier. Yeah, I can imagine doing it when it was just a spreadsheet. I, no, no, thank you.
yeah, yeah. And that was a signal for another startup, right? I saw that myself, and then the other signal that I saw at the time was reverse ETL. Um, I saw how uh, a lot of data teams used products, these SaaS products, just as the last mile visual layer, right? Because they argued like, look, Amplitude is much better at displaying product analytics than we could ever do it in Metaplane or Tableau. And so we're just going to run the transformation, but we want to make sure like, we're all looking at one consistent data set. So we're going to run the transformations in Snowflake or Redshift, and we're going to just dump the data into a table in S3, and then we point Amplitude to that table in S3, and that's what feeds the data. And that was sort of the I think Envoy was the first company where I saw that, and that was the birth of the reverse ETL category. But
It's it's always hard to tell when. I would love to know what your heuristics are when you see this product out in the wild, but like I was seeing, some people were automating like text messages to an exec. Other people were writing the API, like writing the pipelines to go back into Salesforce. And I I don't know, like how did High Touch and Census and Polyatomic and BigQuery like have the vision to see that this was all the same problem or could be categorized and seen as the same problem and they chase after it? I guess the market is still early and
Yeah.
time will tell, but it seems like it's a great category today.
Yeah, I mean, they've both grown, right, and raised
Right.
money from great firms. High Touch, Census. There's also Rudderstack, obviously, and then
Yes.
and which I'm a small investor in, and then Airbyte bought Grouperoo, I think. I think, yeah. They were probably dealing with the problem, and there was enough market demand, and it makes all sense of the world, right? Like, if I have a data team, like why not use that data to feed all my different dashboards? And so we're all like, when we have two meetings with marketing and sales, and they maybe one is looking at Salesforce data, the other one is looking at whatever data, I don't know, right, or financial data. That at least when we're saying sales per quarter, that it's the same number and the same metric that people are looking at, right?
Down with, yeah, shadow data teams,
Yes.
is which is part of the problem that Metaplane addresses too, that we didn't touch on earlier, is like, okay, the VP of sales only needs to be burned so many times before they get a RevOps person to do the same thing in Salesforce. And
Yeah.
then good luck getting them back into Looker when that happens.
I'm curious to hear from you. What is what do you see in terms of data infrastructure? Because that was one thing we had at Intermix that we saw everyone stack. And it was clear that Segment was winning the event data space. It was clear that Airflow was the preferred orchestration tool. Because, at the time, there was a bunch of other open source products like Luigi, Azkaban, and but what do you see? What is like in terms of warehouses, in terms of dashboards? What do you see? Because you have that data, right?
We do. And this is caveat. Wow. Ask Van Louis. I haven't thought of those terms in years. Well, that's a trip down. Okay. For us, our median stack is Fivetran, dbt, Snowflake, Looker.
Yep.
And this is caveated on like mid-market, SMB, some enterprise. And it's amazing to see a 30-person company have the same stack as a 30,000 person company.
Yeah.
Those four tools. The things are shifting a bit, right? The addition of reverse ETL, Sigma is a great partner of ours, and we see much more Sigma than a year ago. I think they're really taking off right now. Uh, but Snowflake is dominant.
Dominant.
Snowflake and
Yeah.
BigQuery.
Yeah. BigQuery really managed to gain market share, and we saw it in the chart, right? Also because I think GCP has the best analytics portfolio of the, and by best I mean products that solve a problem, but also broader coverage in terms of not just the warehouse, but getting data in, transforming data, running machine learning models. It's I wrote a LinkedIn post about that, and yeah, so I think that what defines their success. In fact, Snowflake has very low penetration on GCP, even though they have a GCP product, right? I think Snowflake, it's something like 2 or 3% of Snowflake's revenue comes from GCP, which speaks to BigQuery's strength.
That makes a lot of sense. And it makes sense to, I mean, this is way above my pay grade, but it makes sense for BigQuery to, I mean, for GCP to invest in BigQuery because if, like you said, they have this entire portfolio now. They have like data flow, they have Looker,
Yeah.
and so much more. Is like if they can sell people on BigQuery, they have sold them this entire suite of products, even if you're not using their their infrastructure products.
Yeah. I'm trying to there it is. I'm going to share my screen. This is the post that I was referring to. Yeah, right here. And that data came from from the Snowflake earnings call, right? 2% here where Snowflake runs.
Wow. Wow. We have to talk about Azure too, because they do not get enough airtime for how dominant Power BI, I wouldn't say dominant, but like how present Power BI and Microsoft Teams and Synapse are in the space.
Oh,
Like,
yes.
people don't talk about them, but they're there.
Totally, right? And so I think I had another post on how they go to market. Maybe if we go back to GCP right now, like I listed all the different products here they have. So it's compelling, right? It's a good value proposition. BigQuery, Google Cloud Storage, GKE, like also Google Cloud Billing. They have Google Cloud Asset Inventory that we're piping into BigQuery. So they're making a good move there. And yeah, Azure, they're really great at bundling their products and selling it into their existing customer base, right? That's their strategy. They've built these relationships over decades, right? And their products are good. They may not be top notch in some cases, but yeah, Power BI is a crazy successful product. So many people use it.
And for sure. And it's like relatively new compared to like Tableau and uh, Looker. One thing that maybe one way we can think about these hyperscalers is like, do they have people who love them? And Snowflake obviously has people who really love them. Redshift, I don't want to knock them. I haven't met that many, but there are people who really do love BigQuery.
Yes, totally. Totally. Yeah. Yes. Agreed. Yeah, they love it.
They love it.
Especially the data scientists. They love BigQuery.
For sure.
Yeah.
How much did you work with Databricks much?
Not at all. That it wasn't. So my co-founder Paul is a senior PM there now. He builds their ETL product, but yeah, at the time we had zero exposure to them. Zero. It was just a different world, right? It was the data science world. It was different use case, very much real time oriented for financial services and insurance. So it was way different from batch processing back then.
Right. Yeah, and we still see that partition today, right?
Yeah.
It's the number of companies using both Snowflake and Databricks, which again, this is way far, like 7 levels above my pay grade. It's like they seem to work well together.
Yeah, different use cases, right? So we'll see. But then they're both under pressure to deliver more revenue and growth, right? And so I think they're encroaching on each other's areas right now. And
Right.
I predict a death match in 23 for those two companies.
Yeah, that's the real battle of the titans in our space.
Yeah. Um, so Kevin, is there what else should we cover? I feel we covered a lot of ground. Any insights you still or any questions you still have for me for Intermix back then?
One request that we get a lot from companies is spend monitoring. And you can imagine our customers are using Metaplane and they think, okay, you already have our query metadata and you already have this anomaly detection. Can you please just put the two together and help me understand my costs? And it's something worth thinking about. Of course, we can't do it as well as a dedicated offering or as a service can, but like, do you have any general advice for monitoring, building a tool to monitor spend?
Yeah. I think no company has saved its way to growth ever. And of course, if you ask them, is cost important? Like, yes, very important, right? But reality is they all care about top line growth and more stuff that they can build. I think cost is more relevant now, obviously, with market conditions. The tough part is, and then you hear a lot about FinOps, right? But there's also no dominant FinOps tool right? There's maybe like a new generation of tools now, like Vantage, right? And what's the other one out of YC? Cloudthread, and I think they're seeing a little bit of a renaissance right now, simply because we've experienced a growth period for 2 to 3 years, and now the tide's going out. I think you would for like, what's the use case, right? I think you can build one. The challenge with cost savings or pricing products is always, well, how do you price it, right? If the product is geared towards saving costs, right, your use case goes away once you've saved the costs, right? And I think in the like, a lot of times people will tell you, oh, you should just like charge 10% of the costs you save. Well, okay, great, that works maybe year one, but what do I do year two, right? And then you quickly go into enterprise licenses and bundling it with other products. There is infra cost. They're doing it very successfully with Terraform, right? So giving developers a way to estimate their costs before they do a deploy. And so I'm just giving you a bunch of data points, my thinking around this. I think it's valuable, right? I think people like pricing and cost data. I think you're not gonna. I don't think it's going to be like a standalone product. There's a guy who comes out of Shopify. I forgot his name, but he's doing both consulting and a little product on the side right now, and it seems to be
Ian,
working for him. Yes,
Ian
that's right.
Weiss,
Yes,
love Ian.
he's great.
Shout out to Ian.
Yes, shout out to Ian. We're gonna link him. So he's got a product there, but
Select.dev.
yes,
Also shout out to .dev domain names.
yeah. Here, I'm going to share his. He'll be happy to hear that we're talking about him. Maybe you guys should team up. That's there we go. Optimize your Snowflake workload. So clearly, there's a demand for what he's doing, right? Because he did it at Shopify, and he's successful doing it, right? But yeah, I think. Look, here's how I think about this space. Is there a need for it? Yes. Can you build a big empire on it? Probably not, right? Because I think for many reasons, it's not the feature, right? It's probably also something customers ask for from Snowflake, so they may eventually have that. But I do think in general, it's all these little use cases. I think you're going to see a lot of bundling and integrations. And that's something you saw 10 years ago with the mobile app SDK ecosystem, right? You had an SDK for ever smaller use cases. Oh, push notifications. Oh, 5-star ratings, And so I think eventually we're going to see consolidation. For a company like Metaplane, it makes total sense. I feel like you could say, hey, that's a part of the pie we can get for us. And it makes the overall offering more attractive, right? And now you can layer on, and Datadog did that very successfully, right? And
right.
And I think with your case, with data observability plus understanding the cost per query, right, and then maybe correlate it back to the actual dashboard or analyst, I think that's a powerful offering. I think people would buy the package, especially.
And I think what you said about the value over time is an important perspective, because it's quite interesting, right? Where data observability is not very useful straight off of the bat, right? Give it a week, give it 2 weeks. Now we're talking 1 year
Yes.
in, it's hard to rip it out. And it's almost the inverse of spend monitoring in that way.
Yes. Great. Yes. Yes.
One hesitation I have is like Ian, for example. I don't know how many people outside of Snowflake understand Snowflake costs as well as him.
No one.
No one. So it's like, do you need a person here? Do you need that expertise in a way that is hard to like build into your product? As opposed, so getting the actual recommendation on top of the more generalizable but simple like profiling and alerting.
Yeah. I think Ian also provides professional services, right? Coming back to what we said, I don't know, 20 minutes ago, it's one thing to show what's not working. It's another thing to say, okay, or knowing what needs to be done and then actually doing it. It's three things, right? You need to know why, then you need to know the cure, and then you need to implement it, right? And usually, like none like the actual data engineer doesn't have the knowledge or the time to cover any of them, right? They will cover one, like, hey, the why, they'll find out, they'll build that knowledge over time. But then, I mean, this is something we did, right? We offered query optimization. Like we worked with people who, everyone had these unicorn queries and they were terribly written. And so, but you really need to understand, you can take the same query on BigQuery and Snowflake with completely different performance, right? Because you're still dealing with the underlying architecture of the data warehouse, right? And so you need a lot of knowledge of the actual, a lot of knowledge about the actual underlying engine to optimize the query, right? And so that's a lot of detailed knowledge. And so it makes total sense that you have somebody like Ian who has developed that knowledge and just look at, I assume he will just look at the query and he will look at a data architecture and it will take him an hour. And for an individual query, it will probably take him 30 seconds to say, like, this is what you need to do differently, right? And so I think, again, you'll need a I would say, like, if you have a little bit of a professional services layer on top of that, my hunch is that may find a lot of takers.
I would love to like shadow Ian for a day in front of these queries. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
does he see the matrix when he gets the query plan out of, like, looks at the JSON? Because when I look at that query plan, first, I mean, my eyes go in two different directions, and then I can refocus and look into it.
Yeah. Yeah. And we experienced that firsthand. One of our advisors was the CTO, the former CTO of Parcel. So Parcel is the underlying engine for Redshift, right? And so he looked at queries, and some of these queries would take like 5-8 minutes to execute, right? And it was something that was in the SQL statement. It wasn't about workload management or any of that. And he would just look at these queries and say, this is what you need to change in the SQL statement. And even better if you change your table distribution like this, right? And then obviously with Redshift, you have disk key, distribution keys and all that good stuff. But it would, it would increase speed by orders, 1 or 2 orders of magnitude. It was crazy, right? And it's hard to, like, that knowledge is hard to get.
How much do you think, if we pick like an average company, like that they're like, so then you have like the absolute optimized base case, right? Every query, like without changing the workload, like this is the amount of spend that would take, and then you have like the reality. Like, how much margin of improvement do you think there actually is?
If I take any company today and
Right.
my guess would be it's in a range of 40 to 70% reduction.
Wow. Okay. So
That's
there
my
really
guess.
is.
Yes, that's my guess. And I think you'll find 80% too. But I think the bell curve will be between like 40 to 80% in reduction. That's my guess.
Wow.
And it's a mix, I think, of good practices, like obviously, reducing the number of like, what is it? Is it storage cost? Is it compute cost? Right? What is it? And it's anything between. I think the number one lever is always architecture, data architecture. The second one is how you write your queries, and the third one is how disciplined you are about retaining data in your warehouse.
Right. And 2 and 3 happen to be substantially easier than 1, even though 1
Yes.
is the highest return.
Yes. Oh, well, you're locked in, right? It means you have to build, like, either you're switching the engines while in full flight, or you have to build an entirely new airplane, right? We saw that so many times where they would address performance bottlenecks by doubling the size of the cluster, right? gets expensive, right? Because you're going from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32, right? And so it's expensive.
And now that's where you get these, the P99 queries that cost you that, you know, someone is refreshing their Looker dashboard and doesn't know that it costs $5,000 each time.
Yes. Oh my God. Yeah. I know. Right? Yes. No. Don't touch my unicorn queries. They're
They, yeah, maybe just a fun question. Like, what's the longest SQL query you've ever seen?
Oh, we've seen ours.
Wow.
I think there was, I don't remember it. I think there was a natural timeout. They wouldn't even finish, but I would be, I don't know. I mean, I feel like at least 7 to 8 hours. We've seen that. And then we've seen queries that never finished. And you had cases like, look, where you deal with event data. We had in one case, I'm just sharing that Eero, the router company, right? So there was like huge tables of log and event data. And then some analyst did a cross join of those two tables. I think each table had like 2 billion rows, something like that, right? And so you're like,
Wow. Yeah, that is, when you act, when you're in like IDE and then you go into the running queries and you see one that's like 69 hours. It's like, oh,
yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there you go. 69 hours. I feel like, I mean, look, if you're looking beyond a day, it's like, dude, like, what are you guys doing? Right. But 7 to 8 hours is like, that's something where you're, okay, like, what are we doing here? Why is this query important and why does it run 7 to 8 hours? Right. And it should not, right? It should be running actually 7 minutes. And actually, it should be, if you have your data architecture right, you could probably do it in 7 seconds. Right. And so you peel the onion, and that's perfectly possible, right? Perfectly, it is possible. So yeah, so many stories.
wow. Yeah, it's, you know, data is so difficult in some ways. I feel like, I mean, not in our world. I don't, but I think sometimes externally, the 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 difficulty is underestimated. I'm not trying to say that software is easy. Software is also very hard to build like these at scale robust systems as Twitter is learning now, I think.
Yeah.
But like data has weight, right? That 2 billion row table, that table is there and you're going to have to deal with that as a fact as true as your name.
Yes.
And like there's so much weight, there's the backfilling aspect, there's people's expectations, right? It's you know customers don't expect bug-free software, but the VP of sales, I don't know why I keep saying VP of sales. The VP of marketing expects bug-free data,
Yes.
and we know that's not the case.
Yes.
It's
Well,
never
it's
perfect.
just one number. How can it be so hard to calculate that number, right?
Totally. It's yeah, the whole counting users problem.
Yeah. 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 Kevin, this was awesome. Um, on a Christmas Eve day, no less.
Really, I mean, it's been a lot of fun to chat, and I imagine and or at least hope that we can do this again.
Let's do it again. Yeah, yeah. I think in 6 months' time. I mean, we could stay in touch uh, and talk before that, but like the market is evolving so quickly that in 6 months we'll have plenty of new stuff to talk about.
And maybe our predictions, I don't know if we made claims, but they'll be right or they'll be wrong. It'll be fun to reflect too.
Yeah, yeah. I do think cost savings for Snowflake will be more important in 2023. That's definitely one prediction. And I think, sort of as a side prediction, I think some companies will say enough is enough and they'll just slash some of the madness that's going on. I just talked to Real Data, the CEO, Mike Driscoll, and it's an integrated product. We may see that as well, that the pendulum is swinging back, that some people say we go back to simplicity and an integrated solution. So we'll see. Do you have any predictions other than that data observability will be more important? That's actually one I will make that statement. Yeah.
I'm so happy to hear you say that. It's I try not to bet on races when I'm a horse and the rider in some ways. Uh, I'm with you that I think spend is going to be important, and I think the rise of all-in-one data stacks will also be important. I don't. I think maybe we have to like take a. Some companies will go for that. I think many companies will increasingly choose the 5Xs of the world
Yeah.
as their first data stack. But other companies, it's hard to say. I just think that it'll definitely uh, grow market share. I'm really excited about DuckDB, like
Yes.
everyone is. Uh,
And Mother Duck, the hosted version.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. I don't think, in our world we ever seen this kind of embedded idea,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I agree. Yeah. But I think that's a good prediction. Companies like 5X will be successful, right? Because they're making things easier. And you have like 5X bundles the product with the knowledge. So I think that's a very, very successful combination.
You put it so well. Um, the my last prediction is maybe a bit further out. Maybe it's not going to be 2023, but like two friends, TJ Murphy and Lucas Smith, think a lot about careers. And like TJ raised this question, like, what does it mean to be a staff data engineer? And I had no answer to that, right? Lucas asked the question, like, what really is the distinction between a data analyst, scientist, and engineer? He did something creative where he had 3 job postings and asked people on LinkedIn to say which is which, and I think most people got it wrong.
Yeah.
I think in a few years that's going to change. I can't guarantee it. I wouldn't put money on this, but I think there's people are becoming more and more senior and are starting to, and our industry is becoming more and more mature that we're going to see that. But that's my last one.
That's a good one. God, TJ Murphy. Yeah. I haven't. It's such a small industry. Yeah.
Talk about Snowflake knowledge. He knows everything.
He knows everything. Yeah. All right, Kevin, this was awesome.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it was really great.